Welcome everyone to another Corporate Underground. This week I've chosen the topic, are we playing the game by the wrong rulebook? This is all inspired by reading the book by Simon Sinek. And the idea is that in sport, there are clear rules and a known definitive ending where everyone will know who is number one and how to win the game. But in business, so many companies are just focused on crushing their competition or being number one. And I'm in marketing, I see it all the time. Everyone's saying they're number one at this or that, but usually they're just picking some particular thing that they're saying they're number one in. So my question is, if there's technically no true way to be number one, how can we win? And also, if there is no ending, because a company can live on past its founders and it can technically go on forever if it had the opportunity to, should we be rethinking our goals and our purpose and our driving force for how we choose to operate that company? So any thoughts on this, Tia?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that, what we've got is the almost like these cycles of time that we assume in organizations and in companies. So we sort of like, is it a fluke that an organization would last as long as it does? Or is it really careful thought? And actually, are there particular factors of their own DNA that prevent them from dying?
Well, I just see this from how I feel like a lot of business decisions are made purely to benefit a stock price or a CEO's payout or something like that. Like they're so short-sighted. And I mean, this is seen everywhere. It's seen in government and everything, where everyone's just making such short-sighted ideas and goals and focuses, where we should really be thinking by what actually is beneficial, or what is the actual reason, and how can we get out there and I guess make a real impact instead of just something short-sighted. I see it in marketing all the time.
I think one of the questions is when we talk about business, what is winning? I still don't know what winning is. The analogy you used is around sport, and sport's very clear. There is a fixed amount of time in a game, and whoever has the highest score when that buzzer goes is the winner of the game. But to your point, business doesn't have a buzzer, is the first thing. And the second thing is that if the intention of business, which if we're going to take the more kind of literal corporate definition is to return value to shareholders, then it's not really a ranked issue. It's not about your first and your second, because if you're returning value to shareholders and shareholders are satisfied with the value that's being returned to them, then you're winning at the end of the day. That's your job, is to do that. And if you then want to extrapolate further and say, well, to return value to shareholders, you need to keep customers happy, because if customers aren't happy, then nobody purchases and transacts with you, in which case you can't drive value back to shareholders, and your customers love you, then you're winning. This thing about rank it ties back to this thing about consumerism and the money culture that we live in, which is, we measure by who has the most money or who has the most transactions or which business is worth more on the share market today. But that actually doesn't tell you much about a business at all.
Well, this is what I love, is that, I mean, I get like inundated with people saying they want to be number one, and it comes with I guess the digital marketing landscape. They may be referring to their Google rank or their ad position or something like that, but the fact is I see it all the time that a lot of people, you ask them, what's your goals, CEO or founder, maybe a founder especially in particular, because it's their company, it's a bit more personal, and what's the goal, what's your big hairy audacious goal? And I want to be number one in the world, and it's like, well, how is that possible? Like, how are you defining that? And is that actually going to give you that satisfaction? Is that actually going to benefit you, your employees, your customers, and the greater community?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think we need to look beyond those number one, number two laddered type conversations. What I love is when I speak to founders, and I did an interview recently with a unicorn founder who, his business is a co-founder of a business that's worth 8 billion now. But when you talk to him about what do they want and where are they going, it's not about I'm number one or the business is number one. It's about we want to have X 100 million customers and we want to be valued at $1 trillion. That's literally what he said. And so it's actually not comparing you to anyone else. It's about setting goals for yourself. And what I like about that is that once you get there, you can then reassess and say, well, okay, we might be able to go even further than we thought. And so you keep pushing your own envelope further and further out and seeing where you can go and challenging your own culture, your own team, your own product, rather than going, well, I just want to be better than them over there. Because, you know, to be perfectly honest, when I look at politics, I know I always bring it back to politics, I apologize, but I want to be as good as them, which is what politics is about. None of them actually want to be good. They just want to be better than the others. And what we now have is this lowering of the bar, because all it is about being better, not necessarily about being the best they can be.
Yeah. I think I've seen, like, sometimes when you don't, with the extreme, I've seen the extreme of it where they're so obsessed with their competition that I feel like they're making dumbass decisions, and they're slipping up. And I feel like that's another reason why you need to start thinking like this, because if you think a bit more long term and less about like being number one, like you actually start making good business decisions.
Look, I see a lot of, I mean, I've won a few awards in my time for business that don't pay any bills. A lot of people are focused on being seen to be doing something, but it's what you actually do to achieve. There's so many businesses that want to be number one, and that's great. But at the end of the day, it's your happiness factor. It's how much you enjoy. Well, what you do is you burn yourself out. I mean, I ran a business for 24 years with a business partner, and there were a number of times we were all but out. And only got us through because of the teamwork of the guys that we work with and being bloody minded. A lot of other companies would have shut their doors at that stage. It's consistency and bloody mindedness and what that you put in the bank with those people around you that get you through. The awards are nice. It's nice to celebrate something being the amount of hours that you put in. But I used to work 60 to 80 hours a week. Now, I couldn't have done that with a family. I put a lot of things on hold because of that. But I was driven not to be number one, although that was a sideline. It was to do the best I could and to take my team to the best of what they could do. Those are things that I enjoyed. But it's a point where it becomes relevant. You look at countries that like Bhutan, they don't worry about GDP. They worry about happiness. And if you have a happy bunch of people that you work with and you enjoy going to work, you will do great things. Yes, you have to have goals and focuses. But at the end of the day, it becomes irrelevant if everybody's not there with you at the end that you wanted to be with. That's what I think. I mean, Tia, what's your thought?
I find this topic really fascinating. On the one side, you've got this sort of comparison game, like who's the best of them all, who's the most beautiful of them all, who's the number one in Google sort of ranking of them all. And so by using this comparison, our sights are so short, right? Like you're looking at the next person, or you're looking right around you. It's a very localized position. And then when you're, as Matt was saying just now, you're looking for the longer term, we want to be the best that we can be, or I want to be the best that I can be. It's what I call the law of the averages, where you basically get to a point of average concern, right? Like the pass mark in a class, and then you do no further than that. And so what you're saying, Matt, is by sort of stepping over that and being the best that you can. The person who did the 4-minute mile didn't do that because of a pass grade comparatively. They went beyond what could humanly have ever been possible. And it's because of that we go, we even understand what our edges are and then step over them.
See, that's a really interesting point, because when they did the first 4-minute mile, everybody did it months later. There was a New Zealander called John Walker who did 100 of them 30 years later, when it was seen as an impossible human feat only 30 years before. So stepping through these actually allows us to have a completely different set of goals, and it is an awareness. There is something about consciousness that actually works across. The Wright brothers flew a plane in the US, but the first person to fly a plane was actually a New Zealander 3 months before. Now, these two people couldn't have spoken. So much technology, so many ideas are coming from so many different places. For the first time, we're able to measure that across. The first, well, maybe I'll go back to Mr. Spicy, but marketing, the Wright brothers won. But there was a farmer.
But it's like saying that, you know, Everest was climbed not by, you know, somebody from Nepal first. I mean, it's impossible,
well,
right?
That's the saying, isn't it? It's always impossible until it's done, and then everybody, oh, that's possible now. Okay, so we can.
On that though, there was a beautiful story here about the Himalayas, because I mean there was Turin and Sir Edmund Hillary. They both climbed, but they came back and they wouldn't say who went first because they said it was irrelevant, that it was conquered.
Yeah.
You know, so for those two, they died not knowing who went first, and for the world, we were all interested. Who was it? Was it which one went first? And to them, it didn't matter. They both survived going up, and they both survived coming down.
But this is my point. I feel like there's this natural or unnatural drive to this being the best, like number one or something like that. And I feel like that rule book, like I said, has carried across into something where it just does not suit. It does not match.
I think, Tone, I think a lot of it is also this must be the 40th show we've done in a row that I've said these words. I think a lot of it is contextual, and it's contextual largely based upon the tradition that men have led businesses, and as a result, businesses have been led by testosterone, and that drives a winning kind of attitude and culture. And so I'll give you an example. My very first business, I was very young when I started it. I just finished high school, and we're able to grow and have a good little business. I sold it to a public company in London, and part of the condition of sale was that on their end, it was that I had to be CEO for 5 years, and on my end, it was that they had to move us to the US because that's where our market was. And I remember I moved away from home for the first time, and I was in the United States. I didn't really know anyone. I was in a community. I was completely new. It was completely fresh. And I was one of two businesses in my market in the world that were doing anything of significance. And my who was in Southern California, basically, they had the lion's share of the market in the US, and we had the lion's share of the market outside of the US, but all of the activity was in the US. And he invited me out for drinks early on when I got there at a very fancy 6-star hotel that was not far from both of our homes. And he sat me down, and he couldn't have been more than, I don't know, 2 or 3 years older than me. We were both very young, very naive. And he invited me to have a conversation that went something like this. Something like, it's really nice that you've been able to come out to California, and I've been watching what you guys have been doing out here. And I'm going to let you play in this market for a little while. But don't forget that it's my market. And if you get out of line, I'm going to smack you around, basically, was what he said to me. And that is how a lot of guys see business, that it's this gladiatorial, my turf, your turf, and it's ludicrous. And I reminded him, I think I thanked him for the drink that he provided. I stood up. I said to him, I'm going to put you out of business in 12 months. And I left the table. I lied because it took me 18 months. But
so that wasn't gladiatorial at all.
But what was interesting about that, I probably would have coasted while I was there, just quite happily gone about my business, not really fussed about how fast we grew or anything else. But honestly, that sit down energized me to want to be the premier agency in that space. And it was ridiculous, and it was naive and childish, but it was because of the contest that was thrown on the table that I took it seriously, and that I probably buckled down more than I otherwise would have. But in hindsight, it was a nonsense. We were two businesses in a massively growing market. There was more than enough room for both of us, and the contest was irrelevant.
Yeah, but the contest drove both of you. It drove both of you to do better than you could have by yourself. Now, I used to row. I could never have rowed a scull by myself. It's just not my mindset. But as an 8, we were incredible because we all wouldn't let down one another. Now, none of us rode a single scull, yet there were a number of clubs that had those. Now, it's a mindset thing. Some people do incredibly well by themselves and incredibly focus on themselves. Others work a lot more beneficially with others, and others have drivers. You've got to find out what works for you. And Adam, for you, it was the challenge. For you, it was a gladiatorial. It was. You came through and you did that.
It was actually, you know what it was? It was more of it was a chess game. That's what I liked about it. That that it became a tactical competition. It was a war zone. And it was about who could figure out the right way to do it in our particular industry, and every industry is different. There are particular rules. To Tony's point, sports has rules. You know the rules. In our business,
you raised an interesting point.
Clients, you don't steal each other's clients. And
you raised an interesting point. You raised an interesting point at the beginning. You said females and males. Now, I look at business differently, and some do, some don't. It's a big statement, but mostly I agree with you. But one of the things it starts with, and I'll ask Tia to jump in here, but one of the things that I found in business is it starts from how you get introduced. So when I introduce somebody, it's usually, hi, this is Tony. He runs a web company, very successful. He's number 3 at Google. This is where he goes. Now, when my partner would introduce Tony, he'd go, oh, Tony's married to Miller and they've got a beautiful child, and it's about who they are as a family or who they are as people. How a man introduces in general is what they do. And it seems to be quite different when you just break it down from the very starting point of any sentence, from the introduction of a person. I mean, Tia, how do you introduce your friends? I mean, but that looks at where you are, what your position is, are you number one, what's going on, and how you're driven. And that starts from the individual.
Yeah, totally. A really good question, actually. So when I'm, especially in a business context, if I'm introducing somebody, it will be a professional introduction, maybe some things about them that are very specific to my relationship with them. Otherwise, look, this person's looking for XYZ. I wonder if you can help. It's, sometimes I know people, sometimes I don't. I find it really annoying when people on LinkedIn who don't know me very well will ask for introductions to people who I also don't know very well. So it's a kind of strange situation in the center where it's like, I actually don't know either of you. So I actually don't feel comfortable introducing you to somebody that I actually don't know at all. But I do.
There's nothing lost. You don't know them. They don't know you. Hey, here you go.
It's like, yeah, this person's like, and you can make it up. I find it really interesting when we're talking about the difference and the gender difference here. What's really fascinating in my experience of business, and I started my first ever business when I was 25, is that the moment so my business partner in one of my businesses, I have a business partner, Rod Hackney, a very well-known architect in community architecture globally. And the both of us would walk in and immediately I would be seen as an inferior or a subordinate or, the secretary or the assistant. And we'd sit down, and I just remember this one particular interview, and we sit down and everybody sort of like looks directly at Rod as if Rod's going to start the meeting. And then Rod starts the meeting and then says, this is my business partner, and she's going to be conducting the interview. Vroom. Everybody's now looking at me. And there's probably about, if I'm not mistaken, something close to 9 men. And I think when I got there, they were like, oh, maybe we should bring a lady to the table. So then they had a woman to the table as well. They found it unbelievable that somebody who was 25 was running the actual project. Of course, when we're coming into business with different kinds of products and services, different industries, there are very specific gendered roles.
But I think I don't know your business partner. What's the age difference between you and her?
41 years.
41 years. So I think also, and it may, when you said they angled because there was this 24-year-old woman talking, there may have been a thought process, because I get a lot because I went grey when I was 30, or more blonde platinum, and it automatically gave me a whole bunch of different attention that I was getting before, because I was seen as a lot more mature, even though I'm probably the largest child in any room. So, I mean, like, I think there's both. You got hit by an age thing and a sex thing, where it came together to actually put that on. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm just sort of raising it as a thought. Tony, what do you think when you're in business? How is this going for you, and how does that change where you are in position? From does it make a driver? Does it make a difference?
Well, this is like, I was reflecting on this. The reason why I liked the book and wanted to do this topic was I was always torn when I was running my business in the early days. Okay, because I wanted to grow. I wanted to keep doing better. I was driven, right? And especially as competition came in the area, like what Adam was saying earlier, I love competition. And I think all industries benefit from competition because it's a driving force. Okay. It means you can't sort of coast for any amount of time. But I guess what we need to think about is that there's a balance between competition and because when you're in business, you're what am I trying to say here? You're making risks. You're taking risks when you're making decisions, right? So if you're thinking in a much longer term, you're going to take risks, but you're going to decide, will this play to my bigger goals? Will this play to the company? Or is this just because I'm going to put it all on 8 because I've only got 3 years left and I want to make sure it's either boom or out. Okay, so I feel like that's where people make big ass mistakes, is sometimes they are overly focused on competition or that drive, and they'll make stupid risks or take stupid risks instead of actually making smart decisions. So like as I was growing, I was always torn between this idea of everyone kept asking me, where are you going to grow to? Because I was growing, I was just happy to grow. I was just happy to getting more team, bigger clients, more money, or whatever. I just liked business. And then everyone would be like, oh, what do you want to be? You want to be the biggest in the city, or biggest in the state, and the biggest in the country or the world. And I'm just like, but I wasn't motivated by that. I found it more depressing because I'm like, well, how big do you want to go? Eventually, what do I take on Google? Like there is massive companies out there that don't drive me, where I was more driven by creating a company that would survive without me. Does that make sense? I wanted the company to do amazing things without me having to have any impact on it whatsoever. I didn't want to even have to touch it, and I want it to continue to do the great things that we do every day. That's been my driving force for a very long time, basically before I even hired my first employee. I love this idea that the company would exist as an organism, is the way I would describe it. It had its own life force, and it didn't matter whether I was there or even the first person I had there. Like, I want it to exist. And I feel like that can only happen if you're not, obsessed with things that actually don't benefit the company as a whole.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice idea, Tone, and I agree. And when I started my vote, I had a similar thing, that the movement had to be bigger than the individual starting it. Otherwise, what was the point? But I also think that contextually, it's around, it's about how you position as the founder your most important priorities. And so if you're there because you want, to your point, where you're going to be the biggest in the state, the biggest in the country, the biggest in the world, if the lens is about competitiveness, then that will drive you in a particular direction and you will make particular decisions for that outcome. If, for example, as an alternate, your perspective and your lens is, all I want is to fulfill my potential. My potential might only be the biggest in the state, or maybe it's the second biggest in the state. Maybe that's the best I can get to. But if that's the best I can get to and I get there, then I'll be happy. But alternatively, in fulfilling my potential, what I might find is I thought all I wanted to be was the best in the state, but that was actually much easier than I thought. And then I was the best in the country, and that was easier than I thought. And so as you open these doors, you keep going, oh, there are more doors to open. I'll keep opening these doors. And it's not that you open them because that's what's driving you. It's you open them because that's the fulfillment of your potential. And I know when I was young, and like you, in fact, like everybody on this call, I was in rooms as an 18-year-old that I probably shouldn't have been in, having a successful business. My friends were in first year uni and I was a millionaire already. It didn't make any fucking sense and I didn't deserve it, but that's where I was. And so when you start looking at those environments and you start saying, well, I don't belong here. I don't belong here because I'm young, or I don't belong here because I'm a woman, or I don't belong here because I'm inexperienced, or I don't belong here, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Then all of a sudden you start going, but you know what? I'm at this table and they're not any better than me. They're not any smarter than me. And so you keep going and you keep going and you keep going. And it's not that you're driven by where the destination is. You're just on this journey that keeps taking you places. And I reckon that's cool.
Okay, it's a mate, brilliantly put it, Adam. I mean, the big thing that comes a lot with me is how you reward people, what your focus is on. I've seen so many times where a sales team has being rewarded for one thing, and it actually takes away from profit or takes away from business, because that's what they are having to do. That's what they're focused on. That's what they're driven to do. It happens with business leaders as well. And one of the biggest things I've found is to work out how you want to sell the business before you start the business. From day one, before you even put the business together, how are we going to sell this? Do we want to be a listed company? Do we want to be I just want a recurring revenue? I want this. Now, that can change, but it sets up your business very differently, and your focus is very differently. Because if you want this to hand down to your son, and you want to hand that down to your grandson, you're going to look for very deep and long relationships, and you're going to take your time. If you're wanting to list it within 5 years, you're going to do as much as you can. You're going to work as hard as you can, because there's an out in 5 years. So you're going to do business a lot faster and a lot quicker if that's your goal. But I mean, those things might change. You might get to 2 or 3 years and go, I want to go this way. But it will change the whole company structure. It will probably even change the people that you're with. I mean, I remember being on a massive acquisition where I was looking to grow as fast as I could. And one of my top sales guys came up to me and said, mate, we're going to get to where you want to in a couple of years. This is, but you won't have anybody with you. You're working us to the bone. And I reassessed, and we did it in 5 years. But I had everybody that I started with me. What was the difference? 3 years and a whole bunch of people I wanted to be with, rather than a whole bunch of people I didn't know, but we got there. I mean, so your focus is changing. For some people, that's what they may want to do, and that's okay. It just wasn't what I wanted to do. I'm sure there's different viewpoints on all of these things, but your drivers do change, but you've got to have them. And it might be number one for 6 months. And then it might be, I want to be number one here. It might be, I don't care where number one is. I just want the most profit, or I want to be the most happiest, or I want to be able to not work and get a recurring revenue. These things change, but it comes down to actioning those things.
I think you're 100% right, Matty. And I think to that point, the other thing is you can for the first time ever, I think you can actually get, I mean, it can also change because you reach whatever that particular position is. And so, you actually get to that number one, or you get to that largest market share, or you get to that shareholder return, and you go, I actually had to work in a way or sacrifice things that I don't want to have to do again. So I've done it, but I'm not prepared to sustain it, or that this is not what I want for the next 10 years. I proved to myself I was able to do it, and now I want to go back and do something else, because now I know what that's like. It's not for me.
I find it hilarious that we have imposter syndrome in a game that is undefined. That we're in this environment, whether it's a corporate environment, a sports environment, but in these environments, we are effectively, if there is no game defined, creating roles for ourselves that didn't exist anyway. And yet we have still this sort of anxiety of whether I'm the right person, do I deserve to be here? So
we only got a couple of minutes left, so why don't we end with, since it is an infinite game and not a short-term game, what was one thing that you would recommend someone to focus on, knowing that it's an infinite mindset? Matt?
Focus on the change. Focus on what makes you feel good. And for me, making others feel good helped me a lot. It really made me drive. I wanted a better team, so I worked on that. But it changes. So be agile. Focus on agility.
Tia?
I feel that competition is a really good driver. I think it really builds ambition, gets teams together, gets them into the team spirit. I also think that it's really important for the game to win. So if you take basketball, both teams are competing and their skills are improving, but ultimately the game always wins.
Brilliant.
Adam?
I would say focus on the journey, not the destination. And that although it may seem like you're in the middle of the game, the reality is the game could be going for another 40 years. So just focus on the journey.
Yeah. And my final thing would be that all those things that can be measured do end, and there's always the next step. So that idea of knowing that before you go in, so knowing that it is infinite, business doesn't end, will help you feel actual satisfaction when you achieve those and not empty at the end of something where you finally hit number one. All right, well, thank you all very much for listening. We hope you enjoyed it, and tune in next week for another Corporate Underground. Cheers.